This is a decades-old Fuji Sportif frame. This one is in pretty bad shape. The paint is really scratched up. There's rash on the dropouts. I found several dings in the top tube, but most concerningly, the rear derailleur hanger has been torn off. Normally, I would probably scrap it, but I've been over the whole thing and structurally, I think it's sound. So instead of throwing it away or instead of trying to make it nice, I say we embrace its condition and we turn this into a winter bike. So what do I mean when I say winter bike? Riding a bike in wet weather is tough on it. Headset bearings can rust, chains and brakes wear out more quickly, paint can get scratched up, and even the frames themselves can corrode. A winter bike is one where none of that matters. There's really three things I want to get out of this bike build. When I'm riding in the winter, I do not want to fix flats, so I'm going to run a tubeless wheel and tire. I want the bike to be as reliable as possible, so I'm going to ditch the front derailleur and chainrings and we're going to convert it to a 1x setup. And I want to stay dry, so I'm going to fit a set of full fenders. There's some other things I want to do as well, but we're going to focus on those three. Before we can put this together, we've got to take it apart. So I'm going to strip it down, get everything off that we don't need, and then I'll walk you through what I want to do to this bike. Before I spend any time on this frame, I want to make sure I can actually install a derailleur hanger. So the derailleur hanger does fit, but there's a little notch here where the axle used to sit and then the derailleur hanger would fit around it. And that's almost completely smashed up. It's hitting that, it's not letting it seat flat. So I'm going to use a file here and we're just going to clean this up. All right, that might be it. Well, that's good news. So before I say this is done, I want to put a wheel in here and we'll check alignment on this derailleur hanger versus a wheel. I'll see what I've got that we can just bolt in here temporarily. To check alignment of the derailleur hanger, I used a derailleur hanger alignment tool. This tool threads into the derailleur hanger and allows you to compare the space between it and the wheel at various locations. What we're looking for is the same gap all the way around. When we find that, we know that the hanger is perfectly aligned to the wheel. All right, we're good there. Front to back. Yep. Sweet. I realize I just told you that this bike's condition, the fact that it's ugly, is its strength. I plan to leave it just like that. However, there are a lot of these scratches that go all the way down to bare aluminum, especially the rash. And if I leave those uncoated, when they get wet and they get road salt on them, they're going to corrode. So I will have to do something about those. I've got some spray paint left over from the Chumba build, and the color match isn't great, but I think it'll work. So I'm going to spray some of that in a dish. I'm going to use an artist's brush, and I'm going to fill in some of these scratches. Before I do that though, I want to take a file, and I want to remove as much of this rash as I can. That made more of a difference than I really thought it was going to. So if this was a glossy frame, I would buff this paint now and those touch-up points would really disappear. Unfortunately, this one's got a matte finish and you can't polish a matte finish frame. If you do, you'll just end up with little glossy spots throughout. So this is as good as I'm going to be able to make this look. There's some corrosion inside the frame. I want to remove that before I put it together. So I'm going to use a wire brush and my drill, and I'm going to run it through the head tube, the bottom bracket, and the seat tube. Clean those out, that way when I put it together, it goes together well. Unfortunately, the rear rack mounting holes are both stripped out. To fix that, I drilled out the original inserts. When I did that, they fell inside the frame, so I used a little bit of silicone to glue them in place so they wouldn't rattle. I then installed a new pair of riv nuts and peened them over with a brass hammer so they would fit the shape of the tubing. This frame had some corrosion and paint on the bottom bracket and the disc brake mounts. To clean that off so the new parts would fit correctly, I resurfaced those with a sanding block and some sandpaper. That gives me a nice, fresh surface for those parts to install against. To kind of restore the matte finish to this frame, once everything else was done, I used a fine grit Scotch-Brite pad and I scuffed the surface. That removed the gloss and kind of restored the matte finish. The end result is a frame that looks a lot better than I thought it was going to. These are the wheels I'm going to use on the winter bike. I built these myself a couple years ago. They've got quick release disc brake hubs. These are 6 bolts. DT Swiss R500 tubeless rims and competition spokes. The tires you see here, they're 34 millimeters wide. They're too wide for the winter bike once fenders are on it, so I'm going to pull these off. Typically the Exposure is a tubeless tire, but this is a very cheap version of it with wire beads, and this is not a tubeless tire. That doesn't mean we're not going to use it as a tubeless tire though. My plan is to rewrap these wheels, fill this up with sealant, and run these tubed tires tubeless. So let's get the tire pulled off of this one, get everything cleaned up. We'll put this on, fill it up with sealant, and we'll see if it holds air. Even if I do, I'm not going to have any sealant left in it. Alright. The tires did give me a bit of grief installing them on the rim. The front did not want a seat, it just spewed sealant everywhere. The back went right on without any issue. Oddly enough, after it sat overnight, the front didn't lose any air, but the back went completely flat. So I ended up adding additional sealant to the rear tire. It's sat about a week and neither tire has gone flat since. The true test though will be after we get out and ride it. So once we're riding, does the tire lose air? Or maybe it even goes flat after the ride, after it sits overnight. I'm going to use a Sora 9-speed drivetrain on this bike. I got a good deal on this entire group set on Craigslist. We're not going to need some of these parts though. The front derailleur, the cassette, and even these chain rings. Because instead, we're going to convert this to a 1-by setup. I bought one of these 42 teeth narrow wide chain rings. This one is sized specifically to fit Shimano's asymmetric design. One thing I don't like, however, is how this sort of looks unfinished. I don't like the edge of the crank here just visible. So I'm going to design and print some covers that will integrate the crank into the chainring and make it look a little more intentional. The spider on that crank, the arms are each a different shape. None of them are the same. So I had to measure, design, and print a different cover for each one. The gray here were the initial set, so I printed these to make sure I had the fit right. Once I was happy, I switched over to the more expensive filament. This is carbon fiber PLA. So I printed a few sets until I was happy with the way they fit. These covers are held to the crankset with a small screw through the chainring bolt. To ensure I had a good thread so that these are firmly held in place, I designed a hole into the cover when I printed it. I then used a 3mm brass threaded insert. I heated that up and I melted it into place. What that does is provide a good solid thread for those screws to thread into. Once done, everything is held firmly in place. I don't think I have to worry about these coming loose or falling off. And I think it looks really nice. I think it looks a lot more complete than if I was running without these covers. The rest of the 1x setup is really simple. For the cassette, I'm using a Microshift 11 to 42, so this is an 11 to 42 9-speed. With that 42 front chainring, this is going to give me a 1-to-1 climbing gear. I'm not a big fan of press-fit bottom brackets. They tend to creak and they're just generally problematic. So instead of getting one of those and putting in this frame, I bought one of these conversion bottom brackets from Wills Manufacturing. This is a 2-piece bottom bracket that threads together. And so you thread it into the frame, and when you tighten it down, it presses itself in. And then you're left with a bottom bracket that won't creak and doesn't make noise. The torque spec for the bolts on these Shimano crank arms is 12 to 14 Newton meters. The Sora medium cage rear derailleur has enough capacity for this gearing. The only thing is it needs to be shifted downward to clear the 42 tooth cassette. Wolftooth makes an adapter that they call the Road Link. This moves the derailleur down the correct amount so that you can use it with that larger cassette. The Sora shifters will work fine the way they are. I just won't run a shift cable to the left-hand side. Instead, it'll just be used for braking. I want to use a lot of the parts that came off the frame. The stem, the spacers, and the seat post, they're all in good shape. The stem has most of its riding worn off and it's scratched up in places. And then the spacers and the seat post, these were originally black, but they've faded from sun exposure to gold. So what I'm going to do is sand these down, and then I'm going to spray them with some Krylon textured black. That's a good paint for this because when it's dry, it really closely resembles that factory finish. I went with the most basic set of fenders I could find. These are made of vinyl and they're 46 millimeters wide. That should be just wide enough to clear the 32 millimeter tires. These have stainless steel struts and they did come with all the hardware I need to install them. The fender would not fit between the rear stays, so I used a heat gun to heat it up and soften the plastic. I then used an aluminum rod to act as a mold and I reshaped the lower part of the fender. Once that was done, it fit nicely right into the stays. There is a bit of gap at the base, so I decided I might as well heat it up with it already mounted and reshape the very bottom so it's perfectly contoured into the frame. The top of the fender is held to the stay with a stainless steel bracket. It comes flat, you have to shape it to fit around the fender. This frame just had a hole drilled through the stay here to mount the fender. I didn't like that, so I installed a rib nut instead to give that fender something to mount to. Most of the rigidity for the fenders comes from these stainless steel struts. These struts mount to the bike through holes in the dropouts. I am using the hardware that came with the fender, but instead of just mounting the fender straight through the bolts to the frame, I am adding a fender and a rubber washer. So these go up against the frame and then the fender installs here. And then when I install the bolt, what it does is it clamps the fender to the frame with this rubber washer. That rubber washer increases friction, helps the fender stay in alignment, and it also helps dampen some vibration. Once I bolted the struts to the frame, I did have to bend them to clear the calipers and the drivetrain. I think that looks pretty good. I do notice that the fender and the tire get really tight right here. So I think I'm going to pull it back off and use the heat gun and just shape this slightly so the fender will sort of contour around the C-tube. Otherwise, I think that looks really good. The front fender fits just as well. I had to shape the struts a little bit to clear the brake caliper and to center the fender on the tire. But it looks really nice and there's good clearance between the tire and the fender. My only concern is that my toe may hit this, so it may increase toe overlap. But we'll have to see when I get pedals on it and I sit on it. Fuji deserves a lot of credit here. They installed all the necessary mounts for mounting fenders and they put them in the right spot. That is not always the case with bike manufacturers. Fender mounts are not standardized, so it's hit or miss when you go to retrofit fenders onto a bicycle, whether or not they're going to fit. Fuji made it really easy to put fenders on this bike. Those Sora levers are designed to work with cable actuated brakes. I'm using a set of TRP Spire mechanical calipers. These are post mount. I've got them adapted from 140 to 160 and I'm running a 160mm rotor. To ensure reliability during winter weather, I'm using a set of completely sealed brake cables on this bike. These are made by Jaguar. They're their CSX sealed cable. They use a cable liner that protects the cable even when it's outside of the cable housing itself. So this is continuously run from the lever to the caliper. The brake cables on this frame are all externally routed. I'm using those little clips to hold them in place instead of zip ties. I've had bad luck with zip ties and giving me scratches. To set the initial cable tension for the rear derailleur, I shift into the second cog. I then turn the barrel connector until the derailleur shifts into the second cog. When that happens, I know that the cable tension is about right. Once that's set, then it's a matter of making small adjustments to tension until the derailleur shifts perfectly. The neutral chain line on this bike with a 1x setup lines on about the 4th cog. That's perfect. It's on the slightly higher side of the cassette. That's where I'm going to be riding most of the time anyway, is in those higher gears. I like to wrap handlebars starting in the center and working my way outward. That lets me wrap the bars without using finishing tape. I think it looks a lot better. It's really nice and sunny out today, but it's also really cold. We haven't gotten any snow since I started putting this bike together. So I don't have snow to try it out with, so this is the best we've got. Today I'm going to take the winter bike out. This is its first ride. I've got a 25-mile route planned, 800 feet of climbing. It's going to take us down country roads, dirt roads, and even up through the suburbs. I think it'll be the perfect ride for testing this thing out. So let's get going. First stop, made it half a mile, realized the handlebars were way too high. I pulled out all the spacers and dropped them as low as I could. The saddle was also too low, so I moved that up. We're gonna see how it goes. Let's keep going. I just came off of Highway 7. I am now out of the city. So far, so good. Bike hasn't given me any trouble. I just came down this really bumpy stretch of road. The ride was really harsh. I think I've got too much air in the tires. The sidewall pressure is 65 psi, but that's because these are designed for tubes. The tubeless version is only 35. I've got these at 65 because I didn't know what to do, but I think I'm gonna lower the pressure. I'm gonna save that for the next ride though. I don't wanna mess with it right now. All right guys, take a look where I'm at. I don't mean the interstate behind me. I mean that view. Isn't that awesome? So I'm gonna go up this dirt road. We're gonna see how the fenders perform. I'm back in the suburbs. I just did a top speed test and I run out of pedal at 32 miles an hour. It's about 106 RPM cadence. So, I mean, not bad, right? I mean, how often do we ride around at 32 miles an hour? I just came off the parkway. I pushed it a little harder. I managed 37 miles an hour at 115 RPM. That really is about as fast as this bike can go. I'm on the bike path now. I want to see how the bike does there. But so far, so good. Everything's working out really well. So let's keep going. I just got home. I had a really good time. I've got nothing but praise for the bike. I'm gonna go in, get changed, get something to drink, and then I'll tell you all about it. Man, I had such a good ride today. I really did enjoy myself. I've put a link to the Strava page for today's ride in the description. So if you want to see how it went, or you want to see how the bike performed, well, you can take a look, check it out. I used a 42 tooth chainring and 11 to 42 cassette. This combination gives this bike a top speed of around 35 miles an hour, but that was at 115 RPM cadence. The only thing that took some getting used to was the space between gears. So there's quite a jump in cadence between the outer three. Once you're in the fourth one in all the way down, these are really tightly spaced. So I had no trouble with cadence here. I don't ride in these gears very often, so having the space here between the gears and having quite a jump here was no big deal. The gearing setup here, I think, is pretty much spot on. I wouldn't want to go smaller on the front, and I don't see a reason to go larger on the back. If I had, like, say at 11 to 46, there would just be more jumps between gears and the cadence drops would be more significant. So 42 and 11 to 42, in my opinion, is the ideal gearing for a 1x setup. One of the things that kept coming up over and over again when I was researching 1x drivetrains, especially on sites like Reddit, is that 1x drivetrains are really only for people who live in flat areas. And that's totally bogus. That's not true. So this bike has a 42-42 for climbing, so that's a 1-to-1 ratio. That is roughly the same as you'd get on a road bike with a compact crank and an 11 to 34. So it climbs just like your road bike would climb. So the front fender does vibrate quite a bit. It was making noise. I think this front mount here is just a little too flimsy. So I'm going to design and print a new mount for that. The other thing I noticed on the ride, the tires on uneven surfaces on the gravel roads, they're really harsh. These have got 65 PSI in them. That's pretty high for tubeless tires. But these were originally tubed and the sidewalls say to ride only between 65 and 95 PSI. So that's why I went with 65. The tubeless version of these tires spec a minimum of 35. So I'm going to lower this pressure down to probably 40, 45, take it out and see how it performs. I suspect if I have a problem, it will be leaking at the bead, but we'll see. So I mentioned that during the ride, I had to lower the bars. I took them loose, I dropped them all the way down to the top cap. So this is as low as they can go. When they were up high, they really hurt my back, and I had already cut this much off this steerer tube. So I am gonna mark it. I'm actually gonna cut it off here as well. Get it short so I'm not hauling around all of this. I will admit, when I first brought this frame home, I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I thought it was an ugly frame. I don't like the way it's shaped here. I don't like the really tall head tube. To me, the proportions just look a little bit off. Add in the fact that the paint was all chipped up and the derailleur hanger was missing, and I was this close to just throwing it away. But once I fixed the paint, once I started putting it together, I actually really started to like the bike. There are some things I do wish I had done differently. The big one is the tires. I thought I was kind of sticking it to the man by running tubed tires with tubeless, and they've held up fine. I haven't had any trouble with them. They're not hemorrhaging sealant and they haven't gone flat, but in my mind, every time I ride it, I'm thinking about these tires. I do wish I had spent more money and gotten a wider set of fenders. These fenders are barely adequate for these tires. I think if I had gone with something like a 60 millimeter, it would have provided better coverage and a little more clearance. Those fenders would have required me to reshape them to fit the fork and the stays, but I've done that before and it's really not a difficult job. I should have gone with a wider set of bars. These are 40, that's what I run on a road bike, but they do feel a little bit narrow, especially with the levers turned in for this swept shape. I think a set of 42s would have been a better bet. If you ride in weather like I ride in and you want a bike that's dedicated just for winter riding, putting something like this together actually is a good idea. I really like the One Bite drivetrain. That could not have turned out better. The fenders provide good coverage, and the fact that the paint is chipped up makes it, I don't care about it so much. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I'll see you later.